Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please hit that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Ambassador Chas Freeman. Ambassador Freeman is a retired American diplomat, an author, and a political commentator. Ambassador Freeman, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you, Jodish. It's good to be with you.
I wanted to start with your update on how you see the situation between US and Iran. We are still in the period of 60 days of negotiations on the MOU, although the United States started bombing Iran for 13 days before pausing on last Friday. And since then, we have seen a relative pause, although the regional escalation has to be noteworthy, particularly in Saudi Arabia and Iraq. If you could give us an update of what phase of war diplomacy between US and Iran are we in?
Well, first of all, the memorandum of understanding, or more accurately, the memorandum of misunderstanding, is dead. It is not in effect. It was violated very shortly after its conclusion by the United States and then by Iran. And the Iranians have made it very clear that they will not return to the negotiating table unless the MOU is implemented by the United States. And the United States clearly has no intention of doing the things that it was required to do under that understanding, removing the Israelis from Lebanon, ceasing verbal and kinetic attacks on Iran, enabling Iran to control the traffic in the Strait of Hormuz for 60 days without tolls or fees, and otherwise benefiting from a sort of ceasefire. The ceasefire didn't last very long at all. It was a ceasefire with Israeli characteristics. That is, one side was required to ceasefire and the other didn't. So that's the background. But I think it's very important to look at the last night's Iranian attack on Jordan in context. On Friday last week, Donald Trump had a meeting with his foreign policy and military advisors, who basically told him two things. One, we are nearing a complete depletion of key weapon systems for this conflict with Iran. That includes the ability to intercept Iranian missiles and drones, and it also includes some kinds of standoff weapons, Tomahawk missiles, for example. We have depleted these stocks, and if we continue to do that, we will be unable to respond to contingencies and fulfill obligations elsewhere. So from a military point of view, you have to call this off. Second, from a political point of view, this is disastrous. You are down in the polls now about minus 25% in terms of support by the American public. We're heading for a midterm election, which will determine your political legacy. We are, in effect, reinforcing Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz with our own blockade, which ensures that we're about to experience an energy shock of amazing proportions with huge price increases. And you have lost the ability to talk down prices. Donald Trump has been manipulating the oil market and stock market very openly. So he was told, you have to call this off. And in response, he did. He ordered a pause in the fighting with Iran. What Iran has just done is two things, I would say. One, reinforce the reality that there are two parties to this war, and one party cannot demand and impose a ceasefire on the other. So there is no ceasefire. When you hear CENTCOM say that there was, quote, an apparent surprise attack, there are two words in there which don't make any sense. One is apparent. It was actually a surprise. It was an attack. Overhead photography from satellite shows that while CENTCOM claimed there was no damage and Iran claimed there was considerable damage, the truth was somewhere in between those two extremes. There was damage, but it wasn't probably very great. And second, Iran has in effect recognized that the United States has had a ceasefire imposed on it by its own depletion, its own exhaustion of its capabilities. In other words, the Friday meeting, Iran has recognized that. And in this context, Iran has chosen not to conduct a surprise attack because it has not proclaimed a ceasefire or a pause in the war. Therefore, there should be no surprise that it attacks because it wants to underscore several things. First, its opposition to the continuing American marshaling of forces in its region against it. It has adopted the Israeli standard of preemptive attack as a doctrine. And that will prevail from now on. When Iran sees the potential for an assault on it, it will respond preemptively. This is not in accordance with traditional international law, but it is very much the Israeli precedent. Second, the United States has essentially been driven out of the Gulf bases that it once used against Iran and forced to concentrate in Israel and Jordan. And I think Iran wants to force a concentration of forces in Israel. I don't think it wants to attack Jordan, but it would be very happy to attack Israel. So it's looking to push the American forces into Israel. And in that connection, there are two straws in the wind which are important to note. First, American military commanders have said that the only secure environment for American forces to concentrate in is Israel, and that we should remove our forces from other parts of the region and concentrate in Israel, which is what Iran wants, because that then aggregates the targets in one convenient location. And second, of course, now I've lost my train of thought, but I'm going to say that Iran not only wants the U.S. to concentrate in Israel, but hopes to herd us into it. And I think the other factor here, which is an illustration of the extent to which the entire region is aflame, is the joint U.S.-Saudi attack on elements of the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, which I think serves a number of Saudi purposes very well. First, Saudi Arabia has been constraining the American use of its territory against Iran. It does not want to be involved in a war with Iran. But this attack responds to domestic political pressure in Saudi Arabia to respond to revenge the Iranian attacks on Saudi facilities, specifically Prince Sultan Air Base at Al-Kharj, south of Riyadh. So this is good politics in Saudi Arabia. Second, it reaffirms for the United States Saudi Arabia's alliance with the United States. Perhaps we're not allied against Iran, but we are allied against attacks on Saudi Arabia by other forces. Third, it reminds the government in Baghdad that the Popular Mobilization Forces, which are part of the Iraqi army, need to be kept under control, and that the government in Baghdad will be held accountable when they are not. And it is not a break with past Saudi policy, because the Saudis have been very opposed to various elements of the so-called axis of resistance, whether it's Hamas, on the grounds that Hamas is a democratic movement associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, and therefore a challenge to the legitimacy of the Saudi state, or Hezbollah, because it is Shiite and an opponent of the Sunni forces in Lebanon and Syria that Saudi Arabia has traditionally supported. So this is consistent. These are Shiite resistance forces aligned to some extent with Iran. And so Saudi Arabia's participation in the American attack is good politics in Saudi Arabia, good politics in the region, consistent with Saudi policy traditionally. And of course, and everybody can blame Iran for the attacks. Whether they were in fact engineered by Iran or not is not clear. And the same thing with the other resistance forces. So Saudi Arabia, which has been remarkably passive during the war, has now found a way to be active that serves its own interests. Of course, in the middle of all this, let's not forget, Israel is continuing to conduct a genocide in Gaza. It is building a wall, a separation wall, to confine the Palestinians in Gaza to about 30% of the original territory that they occupied. It has murdered, we don't know how many, but the number is certainly in the hundreds of thousands, not the officially accepted figure of 73,000 Palestinians there. It is on a rampage in the West Bank with active support of settler violence, pogroms against Palestinian farms, families, and villages, refugee camps. And it is, of course, actively bombing and strafing people in Lebanon. It has made an unholy bargain under American auspices with the government of Lebanon, with which it was not at war, to conduct a ceasefire and add to the ceasefire a joint effort to annihilate or curb the power of Hezbollah, which is a common enemy of the government and of Israel. But in doing this, it is aiming at the only force in Lebanon defending Lebanese sovereignty against Israeli aggression, namely Hezbollah. And finally, of course, there is a contest going on in Syria, which involves multiple factors, Turkish influence, and we have the former Prime Minister of Israel, a candidate for office in the October elections, Naftali Bennett, declaring that after Israel brings Iran to its knees, it will have to turn on Turkey. So we see an illustration that Israel has not learned the basic truth that its pursuit of absolute domination and security in its region means absolute insecurity for everyone else and fosters the development of coalitions and cooperation against it. Finally, Israel, of course, despite the meeting between Prime Minister Netanyahu, this is what I wanted to mention in connection with Jordan. I suspect that Netanyahu claims that his meeting with Trump was the best ever. In fact, was probably informed by Trump that we are concentrating our forces in Israel and thought this was a great guarantee of Israel's continued existence, which is otherwise increasingly in jeopardy. But I think, as I said, that from the Iranian point of view, this is a convenient concentration of targets in a single vulnerable area. So anyway, the Iranian attack on the facilities in Jordan was a reminder that the war is not over. And it may even have been an Iranian effort to emulate Trump by manipulating oil prices, which have gone up after the Iranian attack. Sorry, that is an avalanche of information, but best I can do.
Yeah, that's great. I have many follow-ups, but let me pick up on the constraints that the US is facing in terms of conducting this war, as you said, whether shortages or reports about shortages of Tomahawk missiles or missiles to intercept attacks on US bases and their allies, whether the unpopularity of the war back home, which is about 70%, according to some reports, or whether the economic situation, given the all-time low level of strategic oil reserves and the inflationary impact of the oil market that is creating over and above its impact on agriculture, given it is an El Nino year across the Indian Ocean, heat waves in Europe, which are all adding up to prices in agriculture overall. Not to mention Brazil taking lead over U.S. in many agricultural exports because of its proximity to China now. So if all of these are disincentives for the US to continue the war, what is actually keeping the war alive?
Well, I think the main thing is Donald Trump, who seems to have two interests that override the US national interest. One is making money, and he and his envoys, Witkoff and Kushner, have reaped a huge financial advantage from this war and continue to do so. And the second is ego gratification. He dominates the media, the news. Everyone is focused on him. And the malignant narcissist that he is finds this very satisfying. But the fundamental problem, you've mentioned, and I've noted also all of the factors that militate against the continuation of this war. That is to say, the danger of economic recession or even depression globally, the blowback from the American consumer as prices continue to rise. And by the way, there has been a significant rise as a result of the war already, but not yet the major shock that we probably face from the depletion of our oil strategic petroleum reserves and the inability to control prices, and the fact that we require sour crude from the Persian Gulf to produce jet fuel and diesel, which are key to our transportation system, which in fact is also going to go through a price shock due to shortages. All these factors are there, and there is also pressure from allies, none of whom want this war. And we can see the Gulf Arabs who have been protected states for the United States since the departure of the UK from the region in 1967. We can see them quietly talking with Iran about post-war arrangements which will exclude an American presence. So this is all very bad, but it doesn't override Mr. Trump's personal approach to things. I mean, he feels free for some reason to murder the leader of Iran's father and to call him scum and then turn around and say, "What you got to do a deal with me." I think there is a fundamental misreading on the American side, there has been, of the impact of this war and the precursors to it on Iranian public opinion. The assumption has been that the people of Iran will blame their government for having gotten them into this war somehow, even though the war is, of course, not started by them, and that they will therefore put pressure on the government to negotiate with the United States, find a way out. But I think the effect has been the exact opposite. That is, it's the Iranian public that is demanding revenge. And the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, is more pragmatic. And I think very adroit in their conduct of diplomacy. They have a strategy, they've stuck with it, and it disproves the erroneous assumption of the West, the United States in particular, and Israel, that Iranian public opinion can successfully be maneuvered to oppose war by striking Iran. The Iranians we'll find out whether the Iranians' appreciation of American public opinion is correct or not over the next several weeks. The Iranians clearly calculate that they have the ability, by closing the Strait of Hormuz and withholding cooperation from the Trump administration, to isolate the American administration domestically and internationally, and to put pressure on it from political forces due to rising consumer prices and shortages that it will not be able to resist. And therefore, their assumption, I believe, is that the United States will end by doing what it did in the case of round one with Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, namely declare victory and sail away. And here I want to make a point which is not sufficiently appreciated, I believe, and that is that flotilla of roughly 25 ships, one or two of them which are nuclear, requires oil for its fuel. And that oil is not available in the region because of the blockage of both the Strait of Hormuz and now the Bab el-Mandeb, which I can talk about. It's a separate matter, related but separate from the Iran-US confrontation. So the oil is coming from the United States and other places very far away from the region. And there's a line of tankers going thousands of kilometers through the oceans that keeps that flotilla afloat and moving. Second, there's no food to be bought locally. So the food is all coming from American sources or other sources distant from the region. And finally, this is, a logistical nightmare. 5 months of deployments, some cases deployments overseas of more than a year for crews, and the wear and tear on crews and equipment is immense. This is unsustainable, and I think Iran understands that. So I think they are looking, since there will be no negotiation, unless and until the United States affirms and carries out elements of the memorandum of understanding in advance of a negotiation, offers the concessions up front, actually executes them, there will be no negotiation. And Iran will be left in control of the Strait of Hormuz, and the US will be sidelined from the Persian Gulf. Israel will be even more isolated than it has been. And Iran may or may not choose to strike American forces in Israel, as well as Israel, as a final move in this particular round of the fighting.
What is the impact of the increased intensity of conflict between Ukraine and Russia in the recent days on the economics and the supply chain you just mentioned, given Kazakhstan's oil through the CPC port usually used to reach Europe, where a lot of that would be refined, that is leading to disruption in the production of refining. Over and above, those Black Sea ports are also very critical to wheat, fertilizers, and other minerals. So what is your sense of the impact of that on the oil market and the global economy in general? And my second question I just wanted to club here is that it seems to me that Ukraine is trying to link up the war in Iran and in Ukraine in the hope that the United States would be more direct in the support of their war against Russia. What is the attitude of NATO or the US to what Ukraine is doing now in Russia, but also in West Asia?
A lot of questions packed in there. First, the Russians, like the Iranians, have concluded there is no point in talking or negotiating with the United States, which can't adopt a consistent position, can't implement an agreement, can't even understand the situation effectively, is incompetent and dishonest. So that means there's no negotiation going on about the Ukraine war. The situation is complicated by warmongering by Western Europeans who seem to imagine that Russia invaded Western Europe, when in fact Western Europe, in the form of Napoleon and Hitler, invaded what is now Russia. And yet Russophobia remains invincible in most European capitals. So there is war, there is no peace, there is no talk of peace. On the ground in Ukraine, the Russians have clearly concluded that steady as you go is the way to proceed. It chops up, it attrits the remaining elements of the effective elements of the Ukrainian armed forces, which have been very resourceful, but which are manpower short. And it yields territorial gains in a steady pace. Russia has just taken a couple of key fortress cities in the Donbass and appears confident that it can, over time, take the rest of the Donbass. In the meantime, it has shut down in response to Ukrainian escalation against it, both against its refineries and oil facilities and against shipping in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. It has shut down the Black Sea to Ukrainian shipping and is attacking Odessa, the main port. In effect, Russia has rendered Ukraine landlocked. It no longer has access to ports in the Black Sea that it can use for its exports. And this, indeed, as you suggest, all of these developments together are further reducing the supply of petroleum to the world, further reducing the supply of fertilizer, and cutting off essential food supports from both Russia and Ukraine, which are the breadbasket of the world now. So all of that is very negative in terms of its reinforcement of the political pressures on the West and the global South and the United States. This is all increasing. Sorry, your second question was, you buried another question in there at the end. Can you remind me what that was?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the American attitude towards Ukrainian attempt
Yes.
to link.
Yeah, right. Now I remember. The Ukrainian attempt to link the two theaters into one, reflected in an attack on shipping in the Caspian Sea. Yes. I mean, this is a problem. If you give, the Chinese understand, and I think India probably understands as well, that alliances are liabilities as well as assets. In fact, they may be more liability than asset. That is clearly the Chinese judgment. Because if you give an ally equipment and you support it, it may do things you don't want it to do and implicate you in them inadvertently. And that is exactly what Ukraine appears to be trying to do. That is to piggyback on the Trump administration's embarrassment in West Asia to reinforce its commitment in Eastern Europe. So that is, yes, that is happening. I don't know how successful that is, but I would say the response of the Trump administration to Ukrainian demands for additional technology transfers and production facilities is consonant with its denial that there is an ammunition shortage or a shortage of interception capabilities on the part of the US Armed Forces. On the one hand, they deny that, and on the other hand, they assert that they're making major investments to overcome the shortages that they deny exist. But the problem is that even if you have existing facilities in place, we're talking 3 to 4 years to build a Patriot missile, 2 years at least. And so as clever as the Ukrainians are, and they are very clever, so are the Russians. They are very similar people. It's not quite the same, but similar. We're talking about anything transferred to Ukraine not having a practical effect until sometime in the 2030s, which is not in time to save Ukraine from what is happening on the battlefield itself. And every escalation that Ukraine makes with European support, particularly British support, and with backstopping from American intelligence agencies, which provide targeting information, every escalatory step that Ukraine takes generates a counter-escalation from Russia. So this is a losing game. If you're in a war of attrition and you're the smaller, weaker party, that is to your disadvantage. And so Ukraine is living on borrowed time.
You spoke quite a bit on Saudi Arabia in your opening statement. I had a follow-up. You mentioned that Saudi Arabia wants to, of course, avenge some of the attacks on its soil and also contain the Iran-backed or Iran-allied groups in Iraq or broadly in the region. Um, but that's also a break from, I mean, it is consistent, as you said, with traditional Saudi policy, but that is also at the same time a break from what we have seen recently in 2022, Saudi's decision to back out from Yemen, whether
Right.
in an attempt to find a resolution or whether in an attempt to freeze the situation as it was, or the more realistic as opposed to ideological posture of Mohammed bin Salman or Saudi Arabia's talks with Iran, all of which we have discussed. So my question is, even if it is consistent with the traditional Saudi policy in the region, what is the significance of falling back on that traditional expansive foreign policy as opposed to what we have seen from Saudi Arabia in the recent years, particularly given Saudi Arabia is not Qatar, not Kuwait, not Bahrain. It is a great power in the region. And what would be the implication of that in the regional politics?
Yes, I think, well, the key here is actually developments in Yemen and their consequences. Saudi Arabia, of course, backs and sponsors the internationally recognized government of Yemen, which is in Aden, not in Sana'a, and opposes Ansar Allah. For 4 years, as you suggested, there's been a de facto Saudi policy of restraint and some maneuvering against the United Arab Emirates in Yemen by Saudi Arabia. But basically, there's been a truce with Ansar Allah, with the Houthis. That truce was broken when the internationally recognized government carried out an attack on Sana'a airport intended to disrupt the travel of Yemeni delegations to and from Iran in connection with the funeral arrangements for Ali Khamenei, the late supreme leader in Iran. The Houthis have every reason to want to hold Saudi Arabia accountable for the attack carried out by their proxy, the internationally recognized government. And so they did. They charged that this was really accountable to Saudi Arabia, and they attacked the airport at Abha in the Saudi southwest, which historically was part of Yemen, but became part of Saudi Arabia in 1933. This caused a resumption in the Saudi-Yemeni war, which has now taken resulted in strikes and counterstrikes by both. So in addition to having strikes on Abqaiq, the great oil interchange locus in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia from Iraqi resistance forces, we've now got attacks by the Yemenis on the refineries in Yanbu and elsewhere on the Saudi west coast, the Red Sea coast. I think this is very unfortunate. I don't think the Saudis want this to continue, but I do note one silver lining in this for them, and that is this is yet another opportunity to align with the United States against the Houthis and Ansar Allah, who are awaiting an American intervention against their selective blockade of the Bab el-Mandeb at the foot of the Red Sea. Now, I note in that this is a selective blockade. It applies only to Saudi vessels or Saudi-connected vessels, and not even to all of them. We've seen two tankers carrying Saudi oil from Yanbo successfully transit the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb by broadcasting that they are Chinese-owned and operated ships. And clearly the Ansar Allah does not want to get the Chinese involved against them, and so it has given a pass to China-connected oil trade. Chinese ability to import oil has not been anywhere nearly as severely affected as people imagine. China has done two things. One, or three, I should say. One is it has, of course, successfully reduced oil consumption by doubling down on renewable energy and electric vehicles, now including heavy trucks as electric vehicles. It has instructed its refineries to curtail their imports, but also to ban exports of diesel and jet fuel, which is distressing people in Southeast Asia who have become dependent on these Chinese refineries. Anyway, and in addition, there's a fair amount of Iranian oil stored in tankers in the Strait of Malacca and off Malaysia, which is available to the Chinese. So they haven't really suffered here, whereas you in India and others in South Asia and Southeast Asia or Northeast Asia, who are the principal consumers of Persian Gulf oil, have suffered greatly. So, this is, if to the extent that American strategic fantasists, and we seem to have a good supply of such people, imagine that what we have done in the Persian Gulf is somehow going to cripple China, that's a mistake. It hasn't happened. It's crippled everyone else, but not China.
Is it another inflection point in the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia? Because it seems to me in the recent days, like very recent days, it seems to me that the Americans are trying to bring Saudi Arabia more than what it was a bit before that, let's say during the war and the developments in the last few years, probably because it has seen the vulnerabilities of UAE and other smaller Gulf states. And so is it fair to say that the Americans, whether it was Donald Trump's statement about the nuclear deal and the Saudi having to be part of the Abraham Accord, or whether the joint attack that they did on Iraq, it seems to me that there is a renewed attempt to bring or to bank on Saudi Arabia because they need a foothold there apart from Israel, which you described that they are relying more and more on Israel now. Also on Yemen, it seems that traditionally the U.S. interest in Yemen was more in line with the Emiratis, because given that was their focus on the southern areas and the ports and the maritime strategic interest, rather than Saudi Arabia, which is more of an internal government formation. So yeah, my main question to you is there a more energetic attempt on part of Washington to bring Saudi Arabia into its orbit?
I wouldn't put it that way. I think there is a correct sense that the United States is losing major elements of its influence and connection and cooperation from Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have restrained American use of facilities on their territory against Iran. As I indicated, they are now offsetting that with participation in attacks on resistance forces in Iraq, and there may be a conjunction also with Yemen. But it's not so much a push to expand American relations or dependence on Saudi Arabia, except in one sense. You mentioned the Abraham Accords. These are a domestic imperative for the United States. They really don't have anything to do with reality in the West Asian region, where populations in countries like Saudi Arabia are overwhelmingly averse to the idea of normalization with Israel. But politically, this is appealing to Donald Trump's Zionist plutocratic backers and to Mr. Netanyahu and to the whole Zionist lobby. So this is a domestically driven policy, in my view. As for the Saudis, I think they're very cleverly trying to preserve elements of their relationship with the United States while distancing themselves from Washington. And so they're demonstrating their utility in limited contexts, for example, with Iraq, perhaps with Yemen, but withholding the major thing that Washington wants, which is cooperation against Iran. There's one thing I have not mentioned, which I think does deserve mention, and it is important in this context for Saudi Arabia, which is now restricted, with the exception of Chinese-owned and operated vessels, to exporting oil through Suez, which means in more limited quantities in smaller ships. And that is that there's been an active negotiation going on between Iran and Oman about the control of the Strait of Hormuz and what terms will apply. And I'll make two comments about this. First is that Oman apparently made an offer which involved voluntary fees and the expansion of the control mechanism to include other members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. We don't have the details, but that seems to be the essence of it. And this has been rejected by Iran.
The latest report I read at Al Jazeera was they offered 50-50, and Iran said that 50% on our side of territorial waters, but not 50% on your side. Iran needs to have greater control over that.
I think that's part of it, the split. But the fundamental issue is, are the fees obligatory or voluntary? So Oman is trying to straddle the issue, on the one hand, appeasing its fellow members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and on the other hand, meeting Iranian requirements. Iran holds all the cards in this. And that is especially the case as long as the United States reinforces the Iranian blockade with its own. So that's one thing. Here I want to make a point, and that is, if there is a great deal at stake in the control regime in the Strait of Hormuz, because it sets a precedent for other straits. It is a fundamental alteration of the traditional law of the sea, as enshrined in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And it would mark a change in international law, consistent with the Israeli view that international law advances through violations of it. The violations create new realities and new norms. There's a great deal at stake in what the final result of the control regime in the Strait of Hormuz is, especially, for example, for your own country, which is always going to depend on energy from the Persian Gulf, and that will be regulated by passage through the Strait of Hormuz. So this is a moment, I would argue, for an international coalition to step into the discussions between Iran and Oman and try to formulate rules that are the least injurious. There will always be some injury to their interests in freedom of navigation and access to energy sources in the Persian Gulf. In other words, if international law is being changed, where is the international community's effort to participate in crafting that change so that it is not totally disadvantageous to those who are dependent? By the way, the United States is not dependent at all on the Strait of Hormuz. Our involvement in the Persian Gulf was an extension of our role during the Cold War and thereafter as the global policeman and regulator of the global economy. But the Trump administration is not interested in either role. It's all about either Israel first or in the region, or America first globally. So the international community has an interest here, which it seems to be slighting to its own disadvantage. And I would just end with that thought about the Strait of Hormuz, except to note that Donald Trump has crafted a straitjacket for himself in the strait. Same STRAIT, not straight line, straight, notwithstanding the usual text that pops up on video programs.
Yeah, I want to end by asking a brief question on diplomacy, given you are going to give a talk after this interview. But just one question before that on Turkey and its role in the region. We've seen in the news that there have been, I'm not sure if I should say bad relationship between Israel and Turkey, but definitely it's not straightforward. It's complicated. Netanyahu seems to not like Erdogan and Turkey's nationalism. The U.S., of course, wants to sell weapons, as Donald Trump says that nobody tells us what we sell to whom. And
Not true, by the
in
way. Israel
yeah,
has
at least.
traditionally
Yeah,
told us.
yeah, 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 yeah. And then there is tremendous conflict of interest in Syria, in particular, at a time when Syria is the Syrian state is not strong at all and is vulnerable to foreign competition. So, how do you see Turkey's role or ambition in West Asian politics, and how would that play out in terms of great power politics in the region?
Well, Turkey is a great power both in the European context, the Eurasian context, and in the West Asian context, and it can't be ignored. And I would describe its relations with Israel as antagonistic. The Turkish public is overwhelmingly disgusted by the genocide in Gaza, and antipathetic to Netanyahu and his government, violently opposed to the fanatic Zionism that now rules Israel. Just as opposed, I should add, to the Islamic form of that, which is the Islamic State. I mean, there's really not much difference now between Zionism and its relationship with Judaism and the Islamic State in its relationship with Islam. They are both deviant perversions of the basic religious principles that have prevailed traditionally. Israel understands very well that Turkey occupies a central place in geopolitics. It is influential and an essential partner in dealing with Central Asia, with Russia, with the European Union, with NATO, with Syria, with Iraq, with Iran, with Greece, with Cyprus, with the Balkans, with the Eastern Mediterranean, with Palestine, with the Gulf Arabs, with Afghanistan, which is, of course, between South and Central Asia. And it is a major force in increasing force in African affairs. And it is a key relationship of the United States. And it is antagonistic to Israel. It is regarded by Israeli strategic reasoners as an enemy, a potential enemy, active enemy. And this fight has taken on some real bitterness. Mr. Erdogan, of course, is a very skilled politician, whatever you think of his politics. And he is very skillfully using Arab and Iranian antipathy to Israel to his own political advantage in building Turkish, a resumption of traditional Turkish influence in the entire region, including in the Horn of Africa. And so this is a contest for influence and spheres of influence between Israel and Turkey in a fundamental way. I want to make one point, which is a didactic, trivial point, but maybe of interest. When you pronounce Erdogan, that G with a little mark on top of it is all that remains of Arabic script in the Latinized Turkish script. There is a letter in Arabic called wow, which is a W in the normal international alphabet. And that is what that was intended to represent. So the people who devised the Latin alphabet for Turkish preserved one little element of the Arabic script in that, and that G is pronounced like a W. So everybody makes the same mistake. I did that. I couldn't. It took me, since I'm very stupid, it took me several days of time in Turkey to begin to understand that I was not reading that letter correctly. Anyway, Turkey's not going away. It's been there in one form or another for thousands of years as a force, starting with the Hittites, who dominated the region briefly, about 1500 BC. So Israel is right to be concerned about the orientation of Turkey. It is absolutely wrong, of course, to imagine that it can counter Turkey with military force. The Turks are no slouches when it comes to the imposition of force, as any Kurd or North Korean will tell you.
Yeah, thanks for pointing out that mistake of GNW. I wanted to end by asking you about diplomacy, since you said you have a talk coming up very quickly. Why this talk at the moment? Many of us are wondering what would be the role of diplomacy going forward in an age characterized, or in an age where the headlines are more about wars and the more sensational stuff, drones, missiles, fronts, Russia, North Korea, Iran, China, as opposed to the West. And I mean, these are the sort of terms in which geopolitics is being set up in media. Of course, there's diplomacy going on everywhere. I think the Chinese are doing it in their own ways. But yeah, why that talk, and what is your thought about the role of diplomacy going
Well, I'm
forward?
actually appearing on a program conducted by Ian Proud, who calls himself the peacemonger. He is a British diplomat who served in Russia and had his problems with the UK's policies toward Russia, which he thinks fundamentally misconstrued Russian realities and have been counterproductive. He's invited me to talk about diplomacy, which is something he knows a lot about. So I will do that with pleasure. Let me just say that the media like things that go bang in the night and, illuminate it with explosive force. But that is, attention distractor at best. Diplomacy continues, even during wars, especially during wars. Here, I think the classic example is Chinese diplomacy during the Sino-Indian War of 1962 and the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979, in both of which the Chinese used force to make a diplomatic point. And in the case of India and Hanoi, New Delhi and Hanoi, kept their embassies open and functioning during the wars, contrary to the European practice of withdrawing embassies. Why? Because you don't want to lose contact with the enemy, either diplomatically or on the battlefield. If you do, you're likely to be surprised. Your enemy may misunderstand your motives and your intent, and so you want to keep diplomatic channels open. That has been the grave error of the relationships with both Moscow and Tehran on the part of the West. It leads to the establishment of delusions about the conditions inside the countries these capitals rule and about the motives they have in their foreign policies. Um, but let me just end all this by saying we live in the New World Disorder at the moment. It is an order in which I've argued we are seeing the emergence of a multinodal world, a node being a connecting point between multiple relationships, economic, political, military, cultural, and so forth. And part of nodes form networks. And the networks and the nodes alter with time. So they are really, the nodes are really four-dimensional rather than the two-dimensional idea of a pole or a multipolar world, which only works on a bipolar basis. This is a much more complicated world we're getting into. In some ways, it resembles the balance of power environment of Europe in the 19th century. But of course, it's vastly more complicated because instead of five powers, there are many more. And there are regional hegemons as well as contenders for global influence. So my contention is that diplomacy at the moment has been obscured by media misattention to big bangs and a neglect of what is happening geopolitically, partly as a result of those bangs, but partly as a result of communication between capitals that is not visible. But this disorder will lead to an explosive renewal of diplomacy as a central element in statecraft as the multinodal order emerges. So a country like Iran, India, which has traditionally very carefully husbanded its non-alignment, which means adopting a diplomatic rather than a primarily military strategy. Of course, you have a problem with managing hegemony in South Asia, which is not very much appreciated by some of your neighbors. But you have a very excellent foreign minister who clearly understands what he's doing. And there is an Indian tradition of diplomacy rooted in many sources, in the British, in the Mughal period, and in an earlier period in the Arthasastra. So I think diplomacy is not dead. Like the phoenix that is burnt in the fireplace and reconstitutes itself reborn, it will be reborn. It's not irrelevant. It's something to study. And by the way, you can't explain it entirely through international relations theory, which is a product of the Cold War and very heavily game theory oriented, and which is culturally autistic. It does not take account of cultural factors. So if I deal with Indians or Chinese or Thai or Indonesians, I must take different approaches to each because the cultural factors, the reasoning process, the historical knowledge, the background, the national interests are all different. So I think diplomacy is about to have a renaissance. Unfortunately, I will not be around to see it, but because it's going to take a while. But I'm confident of that prediction.
Yeah, you never know. Sometimes things do happen rapidly. We'll leave it there, Ambassador Freeman. This was an extremely helpful, insightful conversation, and thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad you do what you do, Jyotish. Keep doing it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.